Welcome to Oh the Humanities, a podcast produced by the University of New England Center for Global Humanities. Our conversations are devoted to shining a light on the important work being done in the humanities at UNE and other colleges across the U.S. and around the world. My name is Josh Pahigian, and I'm your host. Our guest today is philosopher, ethicist, and peace activist Anna Malavisi. She's joining us remotely from Connecticut in advance of a lecture she'll deliver at UNE titled War on the Environment. And eventually we'll get around to talking about that topic. But first, let me tell you a little bit about our guest. Anna Malavisi is the Associate Chair of the Department of History, Philosophy, and World Perspectives at Western Connecticut State University. Additionally, she's a research associate with the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative at Michigan State University, which aims to facilitate cross-disciplinary research and practice to help meet the complex problems faced by our world. Anna is the author of the 2023 book, Global Development, Ethics, and Epistemic Injustice, as well as countless book chapters, journal articles, op-eds, and blog posts offering deeper perspective and thought leadership to those trying to heal our broken world. Anna, welcome to Oh the Humanities.
Hello, Joshua, and thank you very much for inviting me.
It's my pleasure to have a conversation with a scholar such as yourself doing such important work. I thought maybe we'd begin by talking a little bit about the winding path that's led you to where you are today. You grew up in Melbourne, Australia, I believe, and then worked in England and Bolivia for quite a while before eventually coming to the U.S. to pursue your PhD in philosophy at Michigan State University. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about how the work you did, particularly in South America, before returning to academia, how that work helped shape you as a global thinker, a global citizen, and ultimately a scholar.
Oh, thank you, Joshua. That's it. Yes, that's and I suppose not a bad way to start, or not a bad place to start. So I actually, I always say this: in a past life, I studied to be a nurse in community health and public health, and I also studied to be a midwife, which I completed. So I, a registered midwife and a registered nurse. But that actually took me to Bolivia. So I did my midwifery in England with the intention to go and work in a poorer country in the global south. And just before I finished my midwifery training, I was offered a job in Bolivia as a health education coordinator, specialist, I don't know if you call it. It was with a British nonprofit that worked in many countries around the world. And they provided, rather than providing financial resources, they provided skilled human resources. So, I went to work with a Bolivian nonprofit organization who was building a dam in a small town to provide potable water. And so I was hired to go and teach and work with the community on health education and sanitation, how to best use, potable water. And actually it was really interesting because when I got there, there was a cholera epidemic. And so it was a very a rude awakening for me. It's just seeing how people in the rural areas of Bolivia didn't have access to water and sanitation, which was one of the reasons why cholera proliferated so much. So that was, like I said, a rude awakening to development, but also to the plight of some people in our world. Anyway, so I worked in Bolivia for 16 years, but in very different capacities. And I suppose that's what it gave me insight into, what I do now, I suppose. So for the first 3 years, I was working in this project, in this dam project with, working in community development and public health. And then I moved on to another project working with a network of NGOs and non-profit organizations, national ones in Bolivia, that were working in health. So I was working in this coordinating body. So we used to do research, training of health promoters, evaluation. We had a resource center and things like that. So I worked there for 4 years. But then after that, there was an opportunity that arose to work in the office of the British nonprofit. And so I was project manager for a year for a project that we got some funding from the National Lottery in England, working with disabled people So we also provided, so this organization also provided skilled people to work alongside Bolivian national organizations like speech therapists and occupational therapists, professions that you don't have the opportunity to actually study in Bolivia. So, sort of really prime sort of resources and important role in capacity building. So I did that for a year, and then I became the program director for Bolivia for the organization. So for 8 years, then I was doing development management, not so much development practice, in the sense where I was responsible for overseeing a program in Bolivia. But it gave me also insight into how national governments work in international development, foreign governments like United States, USAID, the British Development Agency, European countries who also provided aid, but also national NGOs, international NGOs, community-based organizations. And I suppose that's when I sort of started thinking about the fact that it's such a complex sector, but also complicated, and there were many problems. So while I was working in development management, I came across development ethics. I hadn't really studied formal philosophy before, but I'd always be interested in sort of philosophy, from an early age. And when I came across development ethics, which was sort of like thinking a little bit more about the means and ends of development, it sort of resonated with me. So I sort of went to a couple of conferences, read some material and articles, and because I did become quite disillusioned about the practice. I thought, hang on, something's not quite right here. We've got to think about this in a different way. So after a while, I decided to leave the practice and do a PhD in philosophy, to think about it a little bit more, which I did.
Was that a hard decision at the time? I imagine it sounds like you were doing really hands-on, sort of on-the-ground work, and you probably run into a lot of frustration in those sorts of roles, but you also experience some of the satisfaction of seeing the direct results of your efforts. And then going back to school and committing to thinking at maybe a higher level about these issues, it's more theoretical. But I would imagine it offers you the possibility to affect more systemic change rather than sort of putting out fires on the ground all the time, so to speak. Was that something you just knew you were ready for? You were burned out and ready to affect change in a different way, or was it something that was a harder decision?
Oh, after 16 years living in Bolivia and with 3 children in tow, it was a very difficult decision. However, I think it was it got to a stage personally and professionally where I needed to move on, because I was frustrated with the system itself, and didn't always see positive results. That's why that was a frustrating part, because I saw that so much money was invested into development from very different sides, or from different sort of entities, if you like. But it wasn't just the reality wasn't there. It wasn't really making the change that it was supposed to have. So it was a big decision, but I don't regret it in the least. And it was hard. It was hard going back into, going from being a program director to being a grad student. It was very tough. But I welcomed the challenge. I loved it. It just opened my eyes a little bit more into what philosophy is all about, broadened my horizons. I was able to, delve into feminist philosophy, social, political, environmental ethics, of course, global ethics, practical ethics, ethics in healthcare. So and also it pushes me to, because yes, philosophy can be seen as a little bit abstract at times, but what I do try and do is engage philosophy or philosophical thinking with everyday problems.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk a little philosophy then. And please keep in mind that I am a non-philosopher, and many listeners, most do not have the depth of knowledge in the field that you do. So I guess I'm trying to say dumb it down for me so that I can understand it. And I'd like to ask, let's talk a little bit about your book. Global Development, Ethics, and Epistemic Injustice. A term you use in the book, one of many interesting terms you introduced to us, but one term is the greening of ethics. I was wondering if you could tell our listeners where that term comes from, what exactly it means, and then how it relates to a couple of other terms you use, the ethics of greening and deep green theory. So how do these frameworks that I enjoyed learning about in your book, how do they help us think in a little bit more useful ways about our environment and our impact on it?
Oh, thank you. I think that's an excellent question. Okay, so ethics, traditional ethics, if you want to go back to Aristotle, Socrates, yes, sort of, but even in the sort of the Eastern tradition, although they were more sort of conscious of maybe the relationship with the environment, but traditional sort of Western ethics very much focused on the individual. And it hasn't been sort of, well, it's just been probably in the last 50, 60 years that philosophers have realized that we need to extend the notion of just humans, or being interested in just humans, to extending it to the environment, and to not only to non-humans, but also to the environment as we see it. For example, the trees, the rivers, the mountains. So the greening of ethics is related to extending the discourse or the thinking, the theory, to include not only human interests, but also non-human interests and the interests of the ecosystem in total, which does, it might sound quite simple, but it's actually challenging, because for so many years we have thought about our existence on Earth as just humans. And I think that's one of the reasons why we are in the situation we are in, because we have not given enough thought to our impact on the environment. So that's what the greening of ethics means. And the ethics of greening is just bringing in an ethical dimension to environmental science, if you like, our environmental thinking. So once again, it challenges us to think a little bit about our relationship with the environment. So I even go beyond the ethics, if you like. So the ethics is how we sort of treat the environment, or what we do, whether it's right or wrong, good or bad, and that's great and that's okay, but it has its limitations. I think we need to go even further than that. When we think about the environment, we have to think about how we see ourselves as, in the environment. Do we see ourselves as part of the environment, or do we see ourselves as separate to the environment? And when I ask students in my classes, it's really interesting, because some of them will say, oh gosh, I think I see myself as separate to the environment. And I think if we begin to think about what that means for us, then I think that it changes the way, not only the way we think, but how we can act on that, sort of what policies can come from that, and what actions we need to take. So if that helps. And so that's the greening of ethics. Deep green theory is coming from Richard Sylvan, who was an Australian philosopher, and it was a little bit radical for his time, probably ahead of his time, and that's what his theory is known as deep green theory, because it really goes into, it's not just a shallow type of ethics where you're just thinking about, like, it goes beyond the anthropocentrism, and it also talks about the intrinsic value of non-humans and the environment around us. So we can't just talk about instrumental value. It's just not a means to an end, or it's just not useful for humans. They have value in and of themselves. And another aspect of deep green theory is he brings in a social political dimension, in the sense that he says that you cannot think about the environment and our role in it without also bringing into a social, political, and economic context, if you like. It's all related. So, these are some of the things that sort of a deep green theory helps us to think about. But as I said, it also provides some input into what we should be doing.
Mm. You mentioned the different levels of commitment that we have, and I look at our society today, and it seems like there are people that care passionately about this issue, and I meet a lot of them at the University of New England, where we have thriving environmental science and marine science programs. But widespread, it seems like people just sort of are content to have their blinders on, even as the real-time effects of climate change are becoming more and more apparent, from superstorms to droughts, rising sea levels, changing ecosystems, et cetera, et cetera. The damage we've been inflicting on our world is all around us, and it's plain to see. How do we change that, the way the general public thinks about this, so that people are more apt to change in significant ways their behaviors and their expectations, and just the way they interact with the environment, so that they're less myopic and more aware of the fact that we're in this ecosystem, we're part of this environment. We need to take care of it, even if we are selfish and just care about ourselves. We should care about the environment because we're so dependent on it. How do we make that shift so that more people come to see it that way?
Well, as I understand the objective of the podcasts and the lectures that you run, you want to sort of emphasize the importance of the humanities. Well, I think this is an important role for the humanities, because we have the science. The science is backing the fact that climate is a problem. There's a problem with the climate. Okay, but what I don't think we're sort of so on the same page about is that there's we have to do something about it, and there's also a notion of responsibility. Whose responsibility is it? I think we could say it's everybody's responsibility. So I think that the humanities plays a central role here, a very important role in education, because I think if people understand a little bit more about what the environment means, what our relationship with the environment means, the ethical dimension as well, what we should be doing, without trying to be sort of like, moral prescriptivists, in a sense where you should do this. That's not the idea. The idea is to make people realize themselves that we all have a role to play in this. And that, yes, as you said before, unfortunately, we can say that a selfish being may not only be concerned about their self-interest, but even they should be interested or care about the environment, because it is our home after all. So I think education plays an important role. And then it's up to us. But as I said, I think the humanities, we've got to get, because I think the problems that we're going to be faced with in the future are going to be social problems. They're not so much, the science can take us to a certain place, but we're going to be dealing with displacement of people.
Yeah, and mass migration. Yeah, absolutely.
Refugees, where are they going to go? So I think, and I don't think there doesn't seem to be that sort of the visibility or the importance of talking about it. All I see at the moment is countries putting up their borders, right, or making stricter immigration laws. Not only here in the US, but in Germany and other European countries, Australia. And I think that's dangerous. I think it's dangerous. Yeah.
Well, you're right that the humanities have a role to play, and I'm still trying to figure out exactly what that role looks like. And I'm trying, in addition to putting the solar panels I have on my own house and the solar panels I'm proud of on the building you'll be lecturing at when you come to UNE. We have a massive array, but also inviting someone like you to come speak at the center and bring your perspective, I think hopefully plays a role in making our young people, our students, more conscious of the proactive roles we all have to take. to tackle this massive problem, and more aware of those social problems, which we're starting to see already in real time and are just going to be exacerbated as the climate changes further and further. Shifting gears just a little bit, on your website and blog, you describe yourself as a peace activist as well as environmentalist. Both of those causes attract people who are very passionate about trying to improve our world, but in different ways. And I'm wondering if you think enough has been done to shape the way we think about these two movements so that they can merge, and so that the energy in both of those respective camps is sort of pushing in the same direction. Is there room to do more to sort of marry those two? And I'm sure there's some overlap. There are obviously, like yourself, environmentalists that also care about peace. But is there more to do to show that this is all, as we understand humans as part of the environment? It's sort of all one movement, right? Or
Yes,
it could be framed that way, I should say.
of course. And I think you're right. And that's why my talk is on war on the environment, because I work in both areas. And so I'm a big I work on nonviolence as a peace activist. We do nonviolence trainings. And so that is part of my work. But I also sort of write on environment, and it wasn't it wasn't too recently when I thought, wait a minute, really, we should be thinking about these together. If we're really serious about addressing the climate crisis, one of the best ways and most effective ways would to reduce war and the impact of war. But that doesn't seem to be it sounds, when you think about it, it's obvious, but it doesn't seem to be like on the agenda, if you like. It seems that the environmental activists, as you say, like sort of thing, what we talk about climate crisis, the scientists, they're over here. And anything to do with war or peace, activism, resistance is over this side. No, I think it's time that we're sort of more connected, and we will have more of an impact. I just think, they're not isolated issues. They all interdepend on each other. So I think it's time that we do. And I know sometimes there's lots of discussion about this. If you do too much, it dilutes the effect and the impact. So, you've got to concentrate on one issue and do it well. I understand that. But it's also, you've got to be aware that anything that you do is going to have an impact on other aspects. So you can't isolate peace activism and environmentalism. They're connected. So I would like to see more of those connections, and that's what I'm trying to do as my work as well. But it's not easy. It's challenging. Yeah.
It definitely is. I wonder if some of so like this generation's biggest tragedies that have unfolded before our eyes have occurred recently in Gaza and Ukraine, of course, right? The last couple of years, previous generations, it was Vietnam, for example, where there was just this tremendous human toll. And I wonder if sometimes people on the environmental side are maybe hesitant to point to the environmental devastation of these mass casualty events because they don't want to feel like they're at all diminishing the human suffering or that human toll. But I think it's useful to excuse me. I think it's useful to see that we're all connected and that the tragedy is shared and affects us all.
I think that's always hard to do because, yes, a lot of people will want to focus on, of course, the plight of humans, which is understandable. But as humans too, we also depend on the environment. So just thinking the example of Gaza, the actual physical environment of Gaza is devastated. It's destroyed. And so you can't talk about any possibility of human flourishing at the moment in Gaza, right? It's miserable. It's a life of misery. So if we take that into account, and as a result of war and conflict, so we can't just even though whether it's a matter of distributing resources and things, but we must extend. I do think that's important. We must extend the way we think about war. Needs to take into consideration the impact we have on the environment as well. Yeah, it's a hard argument to put forward, and not everyone's going to accept it. But I also think, just going back to what you were saying before about the environment and people's awareness and consciousness. So, I've been around a bit longer than my students, right? So, and you too. So, I think that we can say that people's awareness has increased over the years, and
generationally,
and that's come about through public education, writing about it, the media and things like that. So I think sometimes it's harder for us to see, to get more people engaged, but there are a lot more people engaged than what there were. And so I just think we have to continue doing what we're doing. We cannot just sit back and say, well, there's no hope in doing anything, or becoming complacent. I think we have to become more active and doing what we think is right.
Well, I think that's very well said, and I really appreciate the call to action, because these are causes, or this is a cause that I care so much about as well. Anna Malavisi, thank you so much for taking some time to chat with us on Oh the Humanities today.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Joshua. It was great. Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Oh the Humanities. As always, thanks for listening, and feel free to tell us what you thought of this conversation on the CGH social media channels: Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and X.